The movie begins where we see a girl called Katie Standen, a girl who had been locked in a room since she was 1 and is now 13, her hands are chained to a chair. We see her looking through a magazine when suddenly, her father enters the room and tries feeding her. Katie starts spitting out the food onto the floor and her father begins to shout at her. He then picks up the food and rubs it all over her face to teach her a lesson. While all of this is going on, Katie's blind mother Louise hears her scream and is horrified by her husband's brutality. Strangely, she doesn't do anything. When Wesley enters the room, Louise reminds her husband of his pledge to aid Katie if she lives past the age of 12. The next morning, after Wesley has left the house, Louise immediately wakes her son and goes to Katie's room to remove the infant from her cot. They change her clothes before they head to the welfare office. Soon after, the social worker notices Katie's terrible condition while holding her arm and immediately informs the police. Katie and Wesley are both detained and accused of child abuse. When the news reports their story the following day, Wesley breaks down in tears as he drives home after posting bail. When Louise and her attorney arrive at the courthouse, they are swarmed by reporters. Wesley cannot handle the shame and humiliation, so he kills himself and leaves a letter that reads, "The world will never understand." Louise's lawyer claims that she is innocent and was also abused by her husband. Soon after, a team of specialists is gathered to assist Katie in a children's hospital. Dr. Norman Glazer and a behavioral teacher start getting to know Katie before conducting tests. Stan and Sandra start their inquiry and instruct Katie on how to connect with others. Katie carefully caresses her face and hair. When Katie sneezes in front of him, Stan shows her how to sneeze properly by covering her nose with a tissue. Later in class, Stan teaches her how to chew as she was not given enough time at home to learn by her father. Sandra hears Katie talking to Judy Bingham, her special education teacher. When Katie correctly responds to a question, Judy congratulates her. Next, Judy gripes to Sandra about how the hospital received a lot of funding but decided to deal with a graduate student rather than a qualified person. The following day, Katie, Sandra, and the doctor meet Louise at the canteen. Sandra asks the doctor whether she can question Louise about her daughter's past and why they isolated her. Stan tells her to be patient for a while because the court has ruled Louise a victim as well. Later we see them going to a store. When they get there, Katie goes to the meat section and takes a piece for herself. The butcher notices this and gives the young girl some raw meat. Katie then sniffs the meat while Sandra and Stan watch her. A few days later, the team have Katie lie down in a hospital bed while a machine is attached to her in order to measure her brain activity. Suddenly, she wakes up as she is startled by her surroundings. Sandra enters the room and stops Katie from removing the electrical nodes from her head. She begins singing Katie a lullaby which puts a smile on Katie's face and prompts her to call Sandra by name for the first time. In the meantime, the doctor shows the group her report, which shows signs of birth defects. In the next scene, Stan and Sandra go for a walk and conversing. Katie wanders toward a house. As she gets closer, a dog starts to bark which freaks her out. It takes her back to a time when her father used to growl at her and she begins frantically scratching herself. When Judy sees Katie, she asks her if she would like to stay at hers for the night. Katie seems keen but Sandra is unsure about her real motives. The following morning Sandra learns that Katie is being quarantined at Judy's home after contracting rubella. When Sandra later complains to Norman about this, Norman is adamant that they must keep the girl at Judy's house since they can't risk infecting the others. A few days later, Sandra visits Judy to check on Katie. She is impressed by the youngster's development and commends Judy for her work. As they talk about Katie, Judy mentions Katie's propensity to touch herself. She thinks she learned this behavior from adults, which Sandra finds odd. The following morning, Stan explains that Judy has accused him of assaulting Katie, leading to his forced resignation. Sandra is shocked and rushes over to Judy's house to confront her about the accusation. When she arrives, she is told by Judy that Katie is tired of her visits, which angers her. Judy accuses Norman of denying Katie a proper home and threatens him. Sandra is still concerned about Katie. When Katie picks up a magazine and sees pictures of dogs, it causes her anxiety once more. She freaks out and starts scratching herself. A few days later, Louise, who had just undergone eye surgery, comes to see Katie at home. When Katie reaches for something at dinner, Beverly and Sandra convince her to ask vocally. Louise becomes upset and tells them not to force her child to do anything. After Louise leaves, Beverly speculates that Louise might be upset about the idea of someone else taking on the role of Katie's mother. Norman concurs and thinks Louise must have some sort of emotional issue. The following day, Katie has her first period. Sandra visits her and she explains the menstrual cycle to her. Days later, Katie starts kindergarten and meets her younger classmates while riding the school bus. She develops a close bond with the bus driver Kurt, whom she clings to even after being taken home. One day, Sandra tries to teach Katie how to form simple sentences. The young girl finds it incredibly challenging. As they discuss their findings on her, Norman comes and sees that experts from the National Institute of Mental Health have arrived to look at it. Later that evening, Norman tells Sandra that their research was not well accepted by the specialists and worries that they might lose their grant. When Sandra plays a tune on the piano that reminds Katie of the time Wesley beat her, the girl is visibly terrified yet unable to voice her feelings. The next day, Sandra takes Katie and Louise to the beach in an effort to lift her spirits. While Katie is having fun, Louise tells Sandra that Wesley used to beat Katie if she made a noise and would frequently strike her with a stick or growl like a dog in order to keep her quiet. Sandra finally realizes why Katie behaves the way that she does. That night, Sandra introduces her boyfriend Rob to Katie, who is delighted to have a friend and even shows him something she sewed. However, Sandra later reviews her records and discovers that Katie hasn't made any progress. She informs Norman that while Katie is learning new words, she is unable to form simple sentences. Sandra remembers Katie expressing herself through movements and gestures, so they decide to teach Katie sign language, which she picks up right away. Norman receives some bad news that the funding has been stopped. He has no choice but to send Katie back to Louise's house. Katie starts to cry when she sees Norman leaving. A few days later, Sandra pays Louise a visit and lets her know that she's submitted a funding proposal to work with Katie again, but Louise has decided to send Katie to a child care facility as she is not able to deal with her. Concerned that an institute might impede Katie's progress, Sandra suggests that she be placed in a family setting. The family that takes her in are very strict. They forbid Katie from wearing jewelry and even using sign language. One day, Katie throws up while eating breakfast. This disgusts her foster parents, who severely punish her. That evening, Sandra pays the family a visit, but the couple refuses to let Katie see anyone. Sandra explains that Katie has a very troubled background. The Manning family tell her that all the children they look after come from different backgrounds. When Sandra checks on Katie, she won't talk out of fear. Next, Sandra calls Norman and asks him to help her get Katie out of the Mannings, and he quickly agrees. In the meantime, Sandra goes back to the Mannings to care for Katie, but she has trouble feeding her because she won't open her lips. A few days later Sandra asks Amanda, the social worker in charge of Katie's case, to find Katie a new place to live immediately because she won't eat or speak. However, Amanda blames Katie for the situation and doesn't take any action. When Sandra later returns to Katie, she discovers that the girl has been hurting herself. Later, Norman uses his position to take Katie back to the hospital. When Sandra returns to see Katie, she finds that Louise has already taken her. She immediately goes to Louise, who claims that she placed Katie somewhere she chose and it did not work out. Louise also accuses her of treating Katie like an experiment and forbids Sandra and the other team members from ever seeing her daughter again. Sandra is hurt by this but knows she has to respect her decision. Later, we see Sandra talking to Louise. She explains to her that Wesley's mother was horrifically killed when she was hit by a car. This devastated Wesley and he was never the same. He loved his mother and she was the only one who really understood him. They all moved into her house when she died and Wesley would sleep in her bed. They were informed of Katie's condition very early on. Wesley was worried that the authorities might take her away, so he kept Katie imprisoned in her own room from birth. Shortly after, Louise started to go blind and therefore Wesley was the main one to take care of her and he decided on how to bring her up. As Sandra is about to leave, she sees Judy on the driveway and they get into an argument. Judy still blames her and the team for Katie's situation. Judy also poisoned Louise, who believed the fake accusations against her. This makes Louise emotional as she only had the best intentions for Katie. Later, Sandra watches tapes of her and Katie which puts a smile on her face. She and the team have been forbidden from seeing Katie ever again. A few years later, Sandra is seen with her own baby. When she sings lullabies to her, it reminds her of Katie and she sends her best wishes to her. Years have passed and Sandra and her team are still not allowed to see Katie, who lives in a nearby foster home. Sandra often thinks about Katie and wonders how she is getting on. She always had the best intentions for her and wanted to be a part of her life. It eats away at her that she will never know if she is okay and how she is getting on, and sadly, the movie ends there. You guys are awesome if you have made it this far in the video. If you want to see more of such movie recaps, hit the subscribe button to become part of our movie family.